At the end of December on the Western Front during the first year of World War I, one of the most unbelievable and emotional Christmas moments of all time unfolded. On Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, men who had been enemies just the day before, men who had been killing each other, troops who had been fighting one another, spontaneously rose out of the trenches to shake hands, play games, and wish each other a Merry Christmas. French and British troops mingled with their German counterparts in what was known as the Christmas Truce of 1914. The men who took part were able to set aside their differences on Christmas and celebrate humanity and the natural goodness that each person seems to have, and that seemed to be lost to the average person that took part in this war. At least, this is the popular perception of the event. So in recent years, this kind of feel-good Christmas truce where, it's kind of a symbol of moral goodness and the, underlying goodness of humanity has become popular. So I've seen commercials talking about the Christmas truce. I've seen specials on YouTube and podcasts and things like this, and it's becoming very well known. And why not? It seems like a pretty feel-good moment that everybody can get behind. But is this kumbaya version of the Christmas truce what really happened? Is it possible that there was something more to the story? And ultimately, is it possible that the Christmas truce could be overrated? Before you can understand the Christmas truce, you have to understand a little bit about the way that World War I was fought up to this point and the way that trench warfare had evolved before the Christmas truce. You basically just kind of have to understand what life was like for the average person that was fighting in this war, the average soldier. So by Christmas of 1914, trench warfare had become the norm all across the Western Front. So soldiers would basically dig into the ground and find some natural protection from all of the bullets and shells and, the storm of steel that was flying around above the trenches. So you'd basically have the British or the French in their trench on one side. You'd have what was called no man's land, which was the space in between the British and the French trenches, and then the German trench on the other side. So no man's land could be a space of 25 or 30 yards in between the trenches, or it could be 10 times that distance. It depends on where you were and what the conditions were. So each side would kind of hunker down in their trench. They would use this as a defensive spot and then look for opportunities to go on the offensive whenever possible. What was it like in the trenches? How were they designed? So they were usually not straight, as in kind of like straight across, the line. A lot of times they were crenellated to prevent one side or the other from, if they reached the trench, if they made it across no man's land, they would have an easy line of sight if the trench was just kind of perfectly straight down the line. The bottom of the trench was usually just a mess of mud and water that had accumulated there. At this point in the war, they didn't have sophisticated drainage systems yet. They usually didn't use duckboards yet. And a lot of times you just have corpses in the trench of people that had died, because what are you going to do with the corpses? You can't go into no man's land and bury them there because you'll get shot. And if you poke your head above the trench, you'll also get shot. So it was a difficult situation. What do they do with these corpses? Most of the time you'd have some sort of parapet above the trench where you could kind of use that as a way to look at the enemy and take shots if you needed. Sometimes it was sandbags, sometimes it was just earth that they just piled up above the trench, and of course gunfire would just go right through that, so even that was dangerous. In any well-made, sophisticated trench, there'd also be a little bit of barbed wire at the least out in front of your trench in no man's land to kind of slow down the enemy if they went on the attack. Here's Private Douglas Kingsley of the British Army basically talking about what the trench was like. Quote, "They were seldom more than 4 feet deep, so that it was necessary to walk about with head and shoulders bent. They were nothing but man-made ditches, and we had no material for riveting the constantly slipping muddy walls." End quote. He goes on to explain that in that very small ditch, you would try and hunker down, get as deep as you could on the front side of the trench, because a lot of times the shrapnel and the bullets and the shells had this momentum from flying across the other side, and the backside of the trench, even though you were below ground, was actually dangerous. Usually you'd also have a handful of communication trenches that led towards the back areas of the army, the back lines, and this way you could move troops if you needed to, bring in reserves, or pull troops out if you needed to without risking running across no man's land. And it just seems like it has to be true that the early trenches at the beginning of the war just had to have been worse to live in for the soldiers as compared to some of the more sophisticated later trenches that would pop up later in the war. There's accounts I read of soldiers, from the reserves showing up to relieve a unit, and they get to the front line and they arrive at the trench, and as soon as they get there, they ask, "Hey, where's the trench?" Because this little slip of mud and water, this hole in the ground, can't possibly be the trench, right? So they would show up and they'd wonder, what's going on? Where's the actual trench? This can't be real. Imagine showing up to war and realizing that this trench that's filled with mud and corpses and water is where you're going to be living for the next couple of weeks. And oh yeah, there's an army getting ready to kill you on the other side of no man's land. And don't think that this water that was collecting in these trenches was not a big deal. Listen to Private Edward Rowe, another member of the British Army, talking about the water in the trenches. Quote, "The first week's rain turned our trenches into canals. Bail out all day and all night was the order. We are provided with scoops. They are large ladles and are fitted onto a wooden handle about 6 feet in length. Holes are dug at irregular intervals in the trench. The water drains into those. You set to work with your scoop and empty the water over the parapet. It percolates through the earth in time and finds its way back into the holes in the trench floor. Those holes are called sump holes. The object of a 6-foot handle is to enable you to throw the water over the parapet without running the risk of getting shot through the hand or arm. I have seen men deliberately hold their hands over the trench parapet when bailing out with the object of getting wounded. Of course, their heads were kept well down." End quote. So what he's saying there is that this work was so awful and so dangerous that a lot of the men, at least in the British Army, they called them blighty wounds. So they would try and get themselves injured in order to go back home to Britain. So like a bullet wound to the hand isn't going to disable you. It's not going to kill you, but it might be bad enough to prevent you from fighting and get you sent home. So some of these soldiers were actually trying to do that. If you think this sounds bad, we haven't even gotten to winter yet. So the cold is going to take over, and snow is going to start falling, adding a layer of slush to the trench. Your feet become freezing cold. Many soldiers would complain that it's impossible to sleep. So it reminds me a little bit of that Civil War episode I did where we talked about the soldiers of the Civil War, but usually it's not the battles or, the killing or some of the things that you might associate with war that lead to psychological problems, at least during the fighting. It's a lot of times it's the little things. Okay, it's the permanently cold feet that don't allow you to sleep. Okay, it's getting 1 or 2 hours of sleep a night. It's trying to figure out how to sleep on a sheet of mud, basically. It's scooping out water over and over and over again out of the trench, only to find that it's just seeping through the earth and coming right back. It's the trench foot that develops when you start living and standing in standing water for days at a time. The long-term solution, of course, which hadn't happened at this point in 1914, was a proper drainage system and raised duckboards on the bottom of the trench that could allow you to walk on, mostly dry land without having puddles all over the place. We're kind of slowly building towards this Christmas truce moment here, but kind of the point of some of this is that a lot of the soldiers and a lot of the generals and a lot of the public from both sides kind of thought this war would be over quickly, that there was this kind of slogan that it would be over by Christmas. And some of the soldiers actually believed this, but once they got into these conditions that we've been talking about, it becomes apparent that's not quite the case. Now, what was the typical day like for a soldier other than just living in these horrible trenches? Most eventually would be put on what was called sentry duty. So this was basically you had to watch for any enemy movement, particularly at night. So this became incredibly nerve-wracking. Keep in mind that most of these battlefields have very little in the way of lights. It's almost impossible to see anything at night. And sometimes you would just hear stuff coming at you, and these soldiers would shoot it, and then you kind of wait, and you find out what you hit the next morning. And a lot of times these kind of blind shots in the dark would set off panics where you have, all sorts of stuff going off and guns firing and attacks happening that started just by one person shooting into the night. Here's British soldier Bruce Bairnsfather talking about this kind of panic situation. Quote, "A curious thing, this wind-up. We never know when it would come on. It is caused entirely by nerves. Perhaps an inquisitive Boche, somewhere a mile or two on the left, had thought he saw someone approaching his barbed wire. A few shots are exchanged, a shout or two, followed by more shots, panic, more shots, panic spreading. Then suddenly the whole line of trenches on a front of a couple miles succumbs to that well-known malady, the wind-up. The firing becomes faster and faster, then suddenly swells into a roar. Eventually the rifle fire diminishes and soon ceases. Total result of one of these firework displays: several thousand rounds of ammunition squibbed off, hundreds of star shells wasted, and no casualties." End quote. When you read more about trench warfare, it seems that chaos and unpredictability were the name of the game. Now, the worst sentry duty you could have were in trenches that actually extended out perpendicular from your line towards the enemy trench. So you would wait it out there in one of those trenches looking for movement. And if you saw, someone creeping up in no man's land looking to scout, okay, you would shoot and then yell, and get everybody ready for an oncoming assault. But a lot of times, of course, the enemy knew where your trench was and you'd get shot before you realized it. In addition to sentry duty, you could be put on a patrol or a raiding party, where you're basically sent out into no man's land, crawling around, looking for the positions of enemy soldiers. You're looking for any type of information that can get you an edge. And actually, you're looking for prisoners that you can take. If you can grab a couple of soldiers, take them prisoner, and then use them to get intel, that could be a big deal for your side in the war. If you weren't on one of these duties, you could be off, quote unquote off, and you would have some time to rest and relax if that's even possible in these trench conditions. But most of the time you were volunteered to do kind of the menial tasks of trench warfare, laying down the barbed wire, scooping out the water, repairing the trench, burying the dead if you could, etc. And all the while you're doing this, you have to worry about snipers blowing your head off. Both sides on the Western Front would utilize snipers, and different individuals and different units handled that stress differently. Listen to Private Douglas Kingsley of, again, the British Army. Quote, "It is peculiar how under strain and stress a sharpening of humor and wit seems to run through most Englishmen. A constant source of amusement was the placing of an old hat on a stick, walking with it along the trench or bobbing it up and down to tempt a Hun to take odd pots at it, knowing perfectly well that one was quite safe. This was sometimes done purposely so that somebody a few hundred yards further up would be able to spot an enemy sniper being tempted to expose his position by firing at the moving target." End quote. So it really is amazing how some of these men were able to use humor as a way to kind of deal with the horrible situation at hand. But not everyone felt this way. Many people were deeply unsettled by snipers. So here's a British general talking about the situation. Quote, "When going round the trenches, I asked a man whether he had had any shots at the Germans. He responded that there was an elderly gentleman with a bald head and a long beard who often showed himself over the parapet. Well, why didn't you shoot him? Shoot him, said the man. Why, Lord bless you, sir, he's never done me no harm. A case of live and let live, which is certainly not to be encouraged. But cold-blooded murder is never popular with our men. End quote. This idea of live and let live was actually popular on both sides, and many soldiers were uncomfortable just shooting people, even if it was the enemy, as they're going about their daily business. So, the British, as they're burying their dead, do you really want to shoot at someone who's just trying to bury the dead? They're not going on any sort of offensive assault. They're not really helping the war effort in any way. And the same feeling was on the other side. It's one thing to kill somebody, in the heat of a battle or on an offensive assault, but it's another thing to kill someone that's just going about their business. That's kind of one of the weird elements about World War I, where the distinction between when are you fighting and when are you not fighting is kind of blurred, because both sides are kind of hunkered down in these trenches, and the war is just constantly on. There's no breaks. In addition to worrying about snipers, you also had to worry about the reality of getting shelled by artillery really at any moment. So the second you walked into your trench and began whatever you were doing, whatever duty you had, the reality of the situation was it's just pure luck at this point whether or not your life is going to end in a blink of an eye. And you could get shelled at any moment, and you never really knew for sure when that time would come. Listen to one soldier talking about it here, quote, "About 7 p.m. I was standing on a road showing my platoon sergeant where to dig a communication trench between the two trenches, and he, being very dense, could not understand where to start it. I therefore got down into the trench to show him. I had not been down there 10 seconds before 6 shells burst in quick succession in exactly the place where I had been standing on the road, and must have killed me had I still been there." End quote. You can imagine how lucky he felt when, a 6-foot crater appears exactly where he was standing not 10 seconds earlier. That's crazy. We've now talked about life in the trenches. We've talked about some of the daily routines, daily life that soldiers would partake in. And kind of the other thing you could do, of course, is the fighting. So this led to, of course, getting wounded. And this is something that a lot of soldiers had to deal with. There were all sorts of horrifying types of wounds, from shrapnel to shell wounds to bullet wounds to infection and bacteria. Gangrene was particularly out of control at the beginning of the war in 1914. And of course, soldiers were also dealing with mental trauma, mental wounds, PTSD. Listen to this just ridiculous account that a lieutenant kind of talks about, mentioning in passing some of this PTSD type stuff. Quote, "I attended one young officer and 3 men who had been buried in the earth when their trench was blown up. The officer and 1 man were unconscious, and when the man recovered consciousness, he was nervy and excitable. He had a startled, terrified expression, and when in bed, he would peer around in a wild, anxious way, and then suddenly pull the blankets well over his head and curl up underneath as if anxious to shut out his surroundings, or what he thought were his surroundings. He seemed really to be living through some terrifying experiences of the past few days, antecedent and up to the time when his trench was blown up and he was engulfed in the mud and debris. The officer recovered consciousness more slowly and spoke in a curious staccato speech. His nerves were completely gone, and he had fine tremors of the lips and tongue and fingers. He told me that his memory had gone, that he only had a hazy recollection of recent things, which seemed very far away and dim." End quote. The generals and the people who were making the decisions in the army realized very quickly that they couldn't just leave units out here for weeks at a time going through what I just described. So they did their best to rotate you out onto, quote unquote, reserve duty every few days or every few weeks, depending on the circumstance. But especially early on in the war, it got more and more difficult because the battle lines were constantly expanding. It was unclear where the final lines were going to be drawn. The trench defenses were getting more and more complex, so it seemed like every man really was needed. And even if you went on reserve duty, you had your own duties and expectations that most of the soldiers weren't happy with. Quite frankly, most of the soldiers just wanted to relax, maybe have a few drinks, maybe play some cards, okay, get back to normal life. And a lot of these kind of duties they had to do while they were in reserve, they didn't do, and sometimes they could face punishment. Here's kind of a lighthearted tale from a Joe Armstrong, Lance Corporal, talking about the punishment for not doing his reserve duty. Quote, "The punishment was this. He ordered 2 2-gallon jars of rum. It was overproof rum, mind you, to be brought out. There was the regimental Sergeant Major Thompson. He had to take the cork out, and they deliberately poured that 4 gallons of rum out there in front of our eyes. Something should have been done about that. He should have been shot. This here Thompson had his own little individual trench when we were in reserve. The next morning when he got up, about 6 feet from him, somebody had put a tent peg with a field postcard. On it was written, 'This place marks the spot where many a young soldier lost his tot. It was poured out in damn dirty fashion because he'd eaten his emergency rations.' He never found out who did it, but he was livid. It was very appropriate, wasn't it?" End quote. So as punishment, this guy dumped out all the rum, and of course nothing's going to upset the soldiers quicker than that. So all in all, being on the Western Front, especially in 1914, was not a place that I would want to be. I feel like reading about it, it's pretty miserable existence, and historian Peter Hart seems to agree. And by the way, most of this stuff in this episode comes from his book, Fire and Movement, which talks about the British campaign during 1914. But the great thing about Peter Hart is that a lot of historians will just drone on and on and on, but it's very rare where he has like more than a page of his writing. A lot of it is just he'll make a quick point, and then boom, he'll get right into the soldiers, what were they experiencing, okay, the primary accounts, and then, once you get an account, he'll make a couple points back into the actual words of the people who lived it. So you have to appreciate that approach. But anyway, he claims that really no one was ready for World War I. Quote, "The British were not ready for trench warfare. They lacked much of the necessary equipment, not just mortars and hand grenades, but even the bare essentials like waders and ordinary digging tools. It would take months to put things right." End quote. Okay, so now that I've rambled on for 25 minutes about setting the stage for this Christmas truce, we can finally start getting into it. So as things get closer to Christmas, soldiers will start to develop a kind of hesitant respect for the enemies across the battlefield. Now keep in mind that the pre-war propaganda was out of control, and both sides probably viewed the opposite as, the devil incarnate. But once these soldiers kind of settle down in the trenches and they can see just 25 or 30 yards away that your enemy is dealing with the same conditions and they must be going through the same human emotions as you, things get a little different. So this kind of attitude starts creeping in even before the Christmas truce. Another thing is that as things got towards Christmas, as soldiers, they began to think more about their families and the families of their friends. And it makes sense, right? That's kind of what Christmas is all about, spending time in a way with the people that you care about. Here's a private William Quinton who kind of echoes these thoughts, and his friend had just died in the trenches next to him, and he had to take the task of writing this message to his friend's parents on Christmas. Quote, "With mixed feelings, I thought of his parents at home and wondered how I was to inform them, for I knew that my letter would be the first intimation of his death, and not till some time later would the official notice from the War Office be dispatched. One's thoughts were always not so much for the man killed, who was beyond all need for sympathy, but for those left behind to mourn him." End quote. And if you can think this way about the parents of your friends, you're not that far away from thinking about how the friends and family of your enemy must be feeling on Christmas as well. Here's Peter Hart talking about that, historian Peter Hart, quote, "Many Germans could speak English, and there had been a fair number of German soldiers who lived and worked in Britain before the war. Sometimes it seemed almost natural for an attitude of live and let live to creep in. Breakfast time seemed to be quieter, latrine breaks were respected, and men engaged in mundane tasks were left in peace. Soldiers would shout banter to each other across no man's land, and there were even rumors of informal shooting contests at impromptu targets displayed in each other's trenches." End quote. So even before the Christmas truce, we're starting to get a little bit of this fraternizing activity between armies. Now, one of the things that is often thought, probably falsely, about this idea of fraternization with the enemy is that the officers and the generals didn't understand why the soldiers would do this. Okay, they absolutely understood. They knew why people did it. They knew these are just humans they're dealing with, and it's just natural human instinct to, kind of feel emotions on Christmas and kind of deal with it in different ways. So the generals and the officers absolutely forbid any fraternization, but they didn't do it because they were particularly terrible people. They did it because of tactical reasons. They thought it would ruin any offensive initiative from local commanders, and they thought it would ruin the creative spirit of any sort of innovative commanders. So listen to one of these higher up British commanders talking about this, quote, "Friendly intercourse with the enemy, unofficial armistices, i.e. we won't fire if you don't, etc., and the exchange of tobacco and other comforts, however tempting and occasionally amusing they may be, are absolutely prohibited." End quote. So this general obviously understands what's going on, and he says that it's tempting, but he's got a war to win. So if these guys are trying to win a war and prevent more people from dying in the future, that's why they're preventing fraternization, not because they're particularly, insensitive to why somebody would do this. With that in mind, we've now finally arrived at Christmas Eve 1914 on various portions of the Western Front. And keep in mind that some of these Christmas truces happened on Christmas Eve, some on Christmas Day, some in some part of the lines actually extended a couple days past Christmas, so it just depended on the situation. Usually there's a steady and constant barrage of fire, whether it come from the rifles or the shells or, whatever it might be, whatever version of the Storm of Steel. On the Western Front, there's usually always gunfire to be heard. But on Christmas Eve, that fire had now completely ceased. Everybody felt like something unusual was happening. Many were worried, could it be a surprise attack? The men on both sides were naturally suspicious. I'll leave it to Private William Quinton to describe what happens next. Quote, "Something in the direction of the German lines caused us to rub our eyes and look again. Here and there, showing just above their parapet, we could see very faintly what looked like very small colored lights. What was this? Was it some prearranged signal and the forerunner of an attack? Or was it to make us curious and thus expose ourselves to a sudden raking of machine gun fire? We were very suspicious and were discussing this strange move of the enemy when something even stranger happened. The Germans were actually singing. Not very loud, but there was no mistaking it. We began to get interested. The enemy at least were going to enjoy themselves as much as the circumstances would permit. Suddenly, across the snow-clad no man's land, a strong, clear voice rang out, singing the opening lines of Annie Laurie. It was sung in perfect English, and we were spellbound. No other sound but this unknown singer's voice. To us it seemed that the war had suddenly stopped to listen to this song from one of the enemy. Not a sound from friend or foe, and as the last notes died away, a spontaneous outburst of clapping arose from our trenches. Encore! Good old Fritz!" End quote. So in this case, the British saw lights. They heard the Germans singing Christmas carols. Eventually, the Germans were putting up Christmas trees, and soon after this, the British began singing carols of their own. And then all of a sudden, unbelievably, it started going back and forth, with the British singing a carol, the Germans applauding, the Germans singing a carol, and then the British applauding. And eventually both sides sang a version of "O Come All Ye Faithful" together. Not long after this, the calls and the yells of, "Hey, come on over, let's have some drinks, or let's enjoy some food," okay, on this Christmas Eve or this Christmas Day, those calls began to be heard from the opposite trench. And now you're really in a crazy situation here. You've been at war for months. You've been shooting these people over and over. You've been told they're your enemy and that they're not human, they're less than human. And all of a sudden, there's this opportunity. Do you walk out onto no man's land and meet your enemy and have a drink? Or do you remain suspicious? Peter Hart describes what it must have been like to be one of the first soldiers who had the courage to step up into no man's land and start walking towards the enemy. Quote, "The men that took the initiative in initiating the truce were brave, or foolish men. To show themselves above the parapet meant breaking the ingrained habits from painful experiences of the accuracy of snipers. Still, the distinct signs of a thaw in relations meant that some men were tempted to test the waters, despite the obvious risks. Curiosity was like a naked flame burning within them. What were their foes really like? Did they suffer equally from the torments of trench warfare? Were they really the monstrous pickle-hobbed creatures of propaganda, or just ordinary soldiers like themselves?" So this moment of truth moment comes, and the first people on either side get up and start approaching the other trench. What gets left out in the standard version of the Christmas Truce is that people actually died during this phase of the Christmas Truce. So several soldiers would peek their heads above the parapet and end up getting sniped. Some would walk all the way across to no man's land, exchange a few gifts, but then, due to a breakdown in communication or perhaps just a trap, they'd end up getting shot and killed. So it wasn't all fun and games during the Christmas Truce, but amazingly, even though soldiers were hearing this stuff happening, they were seeing people get shot or they were hearing it from miles away down the line, that natural curiosity that Peter Hart talked about is still taking force, and people were still getting up out of the trenches, and eventually enough were up out there in no man's land, and they got out there to shake hands, sing songs, exchange items and souvenirs, stretch your legs. There's reports of football games that were played, and then, of course, drinking and smoking was happening as well. And it's probably true that beer and cigars played as much a role in the Christmas Truce as anything else. Here's one account backing that up. Quote, "The Saxons began shouting, 'Don't shoot, we will bring you some beer if you will come over,' whereupon some of our men showed above the parapet and waved their hands. Then the Saxons climbed over the parapet and trundled a barrel of beer to us. Then lots of them appeared without arms, and of course our men showed themselves. Then, though we had been warned that the Germans would attack us, 2 of our men broke out of the trench and fetched the barrel. Then another broke out and brought back a lot of cigars. All the Saxons then came out of their trenches and called out to us to come across." End quote. So this opportunity to exchange drinks and relax for a little bit on Christmas was apparently too much for some people. Now, once the officers kind of realized that this thing was spontaneously happening and it was going to happen whether they ordered it or not, there's kind of this situation where it's like, okay, what do we do now? I read one funny story where the British officer and the German officer hesitantly, slowly walk out to no man's land, and they're doing it very carefully, making sure they're not going to get sniped and making sure the other guy isn't armed. And they shake hands and they start talking about all the rules and the parameters. So how is this truce going to work? Where are we going to meet? How many men are we going to meet? Are we going to exchange any information? Okay, this, and this will be allowed. What's going to be disallowed? And the officers turn around, and when they're done talking, they see that both trenches have completely emptied out. And despite what they were going to do, the fraternization and the crowding around, palling around between enemies had already begun. Once it became clear that the fraternization was going to go on and it wasn't going to be stopped, practicality prevailed. So both sides left sentries and guards in their trenches in the event of some sort of treacherous ambush. Okay, Christmas spirit is great, but neither side is going to lose the war over this. And then when you read a lot of the accounts, a lot of them talk about using the truce as an opportunity to see the defenses of the enemy. So, hey, maybe we can get some intel from these guys while we're shaking hands, or hey, maybe we can, get a few beers in them and see if they'll open up about what their plans are for the rest of the year. So there was kind of a practical idea of, hey, if we can get close enough, maybe we can see what's going on in the other guy's trench. And this is one of the reasons why the truce happened in no man's land, because neither side really wanted to be stupid enough to allow the other side into their trench. Now, it did happen from place to place, but this is where you get that kind of image of both sides meeting in no man's land. Soldiers actually got into debates with members of the enemy army discussing battlefield tactics and weapons. In particular, the use of what was called dum-dum bullets, which basically expand on impact and create just really awful wounds. So both sides tried to agree that they'd rather use the round-nosed bullets, which make a much cleaner wound. Okay, so it's kind of this opportunity for practicality where, it's like, look, we're both going through this horrible situation. Maybe we can both kind of make some concessions, and perhaps we can do this a little bit more ethically. And it just seems like a natural thing to do and a practical thing to do. Another practical reason to engage in the truce was to have the opportunity to bury your dead. So it was a lot nicer to be able to bury your dead properly without having to worry about getting shot like we talked about earlier. And both sides really took advantage of this opportunity. Many also took the opportunity to just improve their situation, take a break for a day and make the trenches more comfy, lay down some barbed wire in front, dig better trenches, again, all without worrying about getting killed. Here's historian Peter Hart again on this practicality of the Christmas truce. Quote, "It is crucial to realize that for the vast majority of the participants, the truce was a matter of convenience and maudlin sentiment. It did not mark some deep flowering of the human spirit rising up against the war, or signify political anti-war emotions taking root amongst the ranks. The truce simply enabled them to celebrate Christmas in a freer, more jovial, and above all, safer environment, after all the exhausting torments they had been enduring. It also allowed them to satisfy their natural curiosity about the enemy. Finally, it let them carry out vital construction works, which would have been impossible under the constant threat of snipers." End quote. So he lays out a pretty strong case for the Christmas truce being a practical matter more than anything else. But on the other hand, you read some of these kind of emotional conversations between the soldiers and you start to wonder whether, hey, maybe this was some sort of moral epiphany. Here's one soldier talking about his experience discussing what happened in no man's land. Quote, "They said," they being the Germans, "We are Saxons. You are Anglo-Saxons. Why are we fighting? The Russians can't fight. The French won't fight. And you're the only people who do fight. Why are we doing it?" We laughed and chaffed each other for about half an hour in no man's land. We then shook hands, wished each other good luck. One fellow said, "Will you send this off to my girlfriend in Manchester?" So I took his letter, franked it, and sent it off when I got back. End quote. So there you have a British soldier mailing a piece of mail written by a German soldier to his girlfriend back in Manchester. And I can't imagine that possibly would have happened just a few short days earlier, even a few hours earlier. There was, of course, games of soccer that broke out. There is definitely evidence that the soccer was played by the British amongst their own troops and the Germans among their own troops. And there also is a little bit of evidence suggesting that, at times at least, both sides got together for one big game, which obviously is amazing. It probably looked something along the lines of kickball at recess, back in the bus barn at school, but from the soldiers who talked about it, they all said they definitely enjoyed it. And of course, in addition to playing soccer or drinking beer, smoking cigars, just kind of hanging out, enjoying the truce, some soldiers talked about conversations they had which just kind of make you sit back and think about things and think about life. And here's one of those. this is a situation where both sides, the British and the Germans, are actually burying their dead within talking distance to each other. So they're both doing the same thing. And here's what one of the British soldiers said happened, quote, "The Germans started burying their dead, which had frozen hard, and we picked up ours and we buried them. Little crosses of ration box wood were nailed together, quite small ones, and marked indelible pencil. They were putting in the Germans for fatherland and freedom. I said to a German, 'Excuse me, but how can you be fighting for freedom? You started the war, and we are fighting for freedom.' He said, 'Excuse me, English comrade, but we are fighting for freedom for our country. I have also put, here rests an unknown hero known to God. Oh yes, God is on our side.' But I said, 'He is on our side.' And that was a tremendous shock. I began to think that these chaps were like ourselves, and who felt about the war as we did." End quote. So you have this great moment where the soldiers from both sides kind of encounter exactly what they're seeing on their side of the Western Front. So wait a second, how can God be fighting for them when God is clearly on our side? Or how can they be fighting for freedom when we're fighting for freedom? And this leads the soldier to start pondering, some of the big questions about the nature of war and God and this type of thing. Ultimately, the Christmas truce ended like it began, which is kind of sporadically and in a variety of different ways all up and down the Western Front. There were some places where it ended kind of in a gentlemanly fashion where both sides kind of waved their flags, shot up in the air 2 or 3 times, and then that was a signal for, okay, the war's back on. Sometimes troops would get rotated in a day or 2 later, and, they had been having Christmas back in the back lines, not on the front, and they didn't share this special moment with the Germans, so when they start showing up, it's, the war's back on, because they hadn't engaged in this moment. And sometimes it ended with just some guy who was usually drunk trying to pull a Rambo and end the war with one shot. So if some young kid has too much to drink and decides he's going to get brave and fire a shot at the Germans in no man's land, and then boom, the Christmas truce is over. So with the Christmas truce over, the question becomes, how do we remember this? And how should we remember this? So I think the common perception in kind of the popular media, at least from what I've seen, is that, this was, again, some sort of grand moral moment, and now we can, talk about this, and we can gather everybody around the Christmas tree, and we can sing Kumbaya, and we can see if Santa Claus brought that Xbox I wanted. Well, as we've kind of talked about, historian Peter Hart disagrees with this. He says, quote, "For those who believe the truce to have been some kind of moral epiphany, if that was true, then it was short-lived and shallow indeed. Even after meeting and putting a face on their enemies, the average British soldier was more than willing to shoot them the moment the truce was over. Belgium and a good part of northern France were still occupied. German aggression had not visibly diminished. The Germans and French were still embroiled in what they perceived to be a war of national survival. As such, the truce had changed nothing and meant nothing." End quote. So Peter Hart says, look, the Christmas truce was great, but these guys went back to killing each other the next day, okay, for the most part. And guess what? All of these soldiers still had 4 more years of hell on earth waiting for them. So he thinks this whole event is kind of a little bit overrated. It wasn't some grand moral epiphany. It was just a spontaneous thing that happened where people did practical things to keep it going. And then both sides went back to killing each other the next day. In the grand scheme of the Great War, like he says, it was nothing. But I'm not sure I agree there. And I would just point out that for a few short, memorable hours, okay, those people out there, those troops, those soldiers, living and fighting in the worst conditions imaginable, had the opportunity to have Christmas in the trenches and feel like human beings again for that short amount of time. To me, that's not nothing. That's something.